Executive Director of UN House Scotland. And over the next 2 hours, I'll be introducing to you members of our fantastic intern community, 2 of whom will give short presentations about the issues we focus on today. I'm going to just give you an outline of the programme. First, Natalie Balahadra will outline why humanitarian principles changed the nuclear weapons discourse and how they pressurized states parties at the UN to create, sign, and for over 50 of them to ratify a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Immediately after Natalie, Laura Buck's presentation will refer to a substantive case study she developed for her master's degree on humanitarian rights to a healthy environment. After these 2 presentations, there will be time for discussion. Whilst both Natalie and Laura will be delighted, I'm sure, to answer questions, we do hope that the 20 minutes will be sufficient time for us all to articulate our immediate thoughts and ideas. At just before 3, we will have a 5-minute break, and then at 3, we'll move into breakout groups. There are 4 groups, and each participant will be placed with a facilitator and a UN House rapporteur. The facilitators will ensure that the conversations flow, hopefully, and key points will be noted by the rapporteurs. 2 facilitators, Janet and David, will chair the feedback session before I reappear, technology willing, to say a few concluding comments. Can I just double check, Hannah, that we are actually recording at the moment?
Yes, Gary, we are.
Thank you. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our 2 presenters. There'll be first one and then the other. The first is Natalie Balahadra, a final year undergraduate student in economics and politics at the University of Edinburgh. And she's currently writing her undergraduate thesis on how the existence of nuclear weapons has impacted the human rights commitments of nuclear weapon states. She has a particular interest in global security, gender equality, and nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. And alongside working with the UN House in Scotland, Natalie is also an intern at the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy. This year, she was the research director at Scotland's only student-led think tank, the Buchanan Institute, and was the marketing director for the University of Edinburgh's Women in Politics and International Relations Society. She hopes to study for a master's degree next year in the US. Her presentation is entitled The Humanitarian Imperative as a Lens to Address Human Rights in Scotland, Lessons from the TPNW. Immediately after Natalie, Laura will speak. Laura Buck is a recent graduate from the University of Edinburgh, where she completed her master's degree in international development. Her research focused on human rights to a healthy environment among economic and socially deprived citizens in Scotland. She came to UN House last year for her research and has progressed to being the co-coordinator of the human rights team. Laura has previously worked in China, focusing on women's rights. This project has since expanded to advocate for the rights of disempowered groups in societies, mainly for those classed as homeless or impoverished. The presentation she's about to deliver is centered around her master's research, which aims to draw attention to and alleviate the suffering and burdens placed on those without a strong voice in civil society. Her presentation is entitled Environmental Rights and the Human Right to a Healthy Environment. So with that introduction to the programme and to our speakers, I'd like to ask Natalie to take us forward. Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you, Gary. I just wanted to reiterate, it's really nice to see everyone, and I'm really excited for this roundtable event. It's very needed, so I'm glad that these conversations are finally being had. Now, Hannah, if you could please share your screen with my presentation. Thank you. It is as though we can strangulate this beast from all directions, but not quite strike directly at its heart. Those were the words of Nobuo Hayashi from the University of Oslo at the third conference on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Since the advent of the atomic bomb, the discourse surrounding nuclear weapons and their explosive power has focused solely on their instrumental value for national security in a world plagued by anarchy and distrust. The irony is further epitomized in the US simultaneously preparing to create the UN while also preparing to drop atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing both hope and death at the same time. To this day, this would be the only instance in which a country has used an atomic or nuclear weapon on one another. Whether this is due to a sort of nuclear taboo or pure luck is still contested. However, the huge efforts of civil society and NGOs cannot be ignored in addressing the emergent and ever stronger global anti-nuclear movement. In her seminal work, Becky Alexis Martin characterizes nuclear weapons as a phenomenon of blurred boundaries. They are everywhere and nowhere. They transcend war and peace. They amalgamate war zone and homeland, and they merge the real and virtual. In this light, the Humanitarian Initiative developed and drafted by civil society actors and the governments of non-nuclear weapon states, with the help of the poignant testimonies of the Hibakusha, in Japanese, a person affected by a bomb, epitomized the rethinking of weapons, security, and militarist discourse towards one that centered humans and their right to live life in peace. While the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has addressed humanitarian principles as respecting and upholding humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, the Humanitarian Initiative in Nuclear Disarmament has roots in the 1997 Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention and the 2008 Convention on the Cluster Munitions. The TPNW, or ban treaty, underlines the importance of the humanitarian angle of nuclear weapons use, both past and present, particularly drawing inspiration from the testimonies of the Hibakusha. Notably, the treaty explicitly focuses on providing support to victims of nuclear weapons use and testing, which was highlighted as an inescapable conclusion of the Vienna Conference, with the Austrian government pledging to fill the gap between nuclear weapons and their immorality. Beatrice Finn, the executive director of ICANN, who accepted the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of ICANN, has argued that the TPNW seeks to mobilize a shift in perceptions on security, showing the centrality of humanitarian consequences in policies and doctrines. In 2012, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 6756 on taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations, which created a working group concerning the ubiquitous raised awareness on the human and environmental consequences of nuclear weapons. Following 3 conferences in Norway, 2013, Mexico, 2014, and Austria, 2014, the Humanitarian Initiative materialized into a Humanitarian Pledge at the Vienna Conference, which 158 states attended and 127 of them signed the pledge. The Humanitarian Pledge translated all the factual information and discussions into political will for the creation of a legal mechanism that would finally abolish nuclear weapons. On July 7th, 2017, 122 states voted for the adoption of the TPNW at a General Assembly meeting, and on January 22nd, 2021, a couple of months ago, the treaty came into force. This means that all states who have ratified the treaty will be obligated to respect its stipulations. The TPNW prohibits the development, testing, production, manufacture, and otherwise acquisition of nuclear weapons or nuclear explosive devices, as well as receiving or transferring the above. It also bans the threat of using such weapons against states and details an ascension plan for nuclear weapon states or those housing nuclear weapons, insofar as they must either renounce their nuclear weapons before or during ascension. There are currently 86 signatories and 52 state parties. In December 2020, 130 states in the UN General Assembly voted in favor of the TPNW. This cannot be ignored. Since 1707, Britain has been a cohesive body of states. The Union Jack is thought to stand in front of the international community, representing the voices of everyone across this small island. But the reality of this union is far from perfect. A number of issues divide us, particularly the issue of a nuclear Britain. The nuclear base at Faslane comprises 2 miles on the eastern shore of Gairloch, a serene and rural landscape. Once home to the Glaswegian gentry, Faslane is a forestry area with beautiful rocky beaches. It is not the physical existence of the nuclear submarine base itself that marks an uncomfortable contradiction with Scotland's majestic natural environment, but the associated values of threat, violence, and devastation which it reeks of. The civil society movement Faslane 365 comprised of a range of local, national, and international groups created following the announcement of the Trident replacement in 2006. The SNP have been particularly successful in pushing the issue of nuclear weapons to the forefront of independence as the DNA of both the SNP and Scotland. Evidently, nuclear disarmament is a commitment reverberated throughout the Scottish government and civil society. Like nuclear weapons, the issue of upholding human rights has manifested into an increasing awareness that it is simply not enough to ensure one's individual rights. We occupy, live, breathe in, walk around in collective spaces. We have a collective responsibility and right to these areas and their infrastructures. We understand the theoretical differences between humanitarianism and human rights. Human rights is based on a discourse of rights, whereas humanitarianism is based on needs. While human rights has a legal framework, humanitarianism is grounded on moral codes and sentiments. And while human rights is more long-term, humanitarianism is usually geared towards the urgent and immediate goals of keeping people alive. But how can we have a universal human rights that doesn't respect the rights of everyone? Are the basic needs, our basic necessities not a right? We believe there is an overlap between the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and a human rights framework. Human rights must center humanity and uphold neutrality, impartiality, and independence so that no one is left behind. That is a crucial value in the SDGs, and it is what is hoped to be achieved. Scotland has a crucial window of opportunity to change the discourse around human rights, just as its people and policymakers had contributed enormously to the TPNW humanitarian initiative.
Thank you, Natalie. As Gary said, I'm Laura, and I'm happy to be here speaking to you all today. Thank you so much for joining. My presentation centres around the environmental rights, in particular our human rights to a healthy environment, as Gary said. So, Hannah, could you please share your screen? Thank you. Okay. So the image that you can see here on the left-hand side shows the current landscape at Sheriff Hall Roundabout, which is a roundabout in Edinburgh. And the image on the right-hand side shows the proposed projection of what the area will potentially look like in the future. And I'll clarify the relevance of these landscapes to human rights in my coming discussion. So the problem that we've identified during our discussions over time in the human rights team is that, some of you may be aware, but Transport Scotland have proposed a flyover at the Sheriff Hall roundabout in Edinburgh. And the concern here is that it will bring increased traffic-related air pollution to the surrounding area and communities. So health issues already exist everywhere, most significantly in the surrounding areas of Sheriff Hall, which possess multiple deprivation, which is evidenced by the Scottish Index for Multiple Deprivations. It shows communities around the Sheriff Hall area are significantly deprived in terms of income, housing conditions, employment, education, crime, and most notably in this discussion, health. The flyover will arguably exacerbate these deprivations and inequalities. It may lead to diminished well-being and increased injustices experienced by socioeconomically deprived communities. But despite these concerns, it's anticipated that the proposal will go ahead. But how can this be just or fair or aligned with everyone's right to a healthy environment, and as this is stated in international human rights legislation? So the argument that we at UN House are trying to make is that with it being the case that the proposal would negatively impact the human right to a healthy environment, especially for those living in and around the proposed site at Sheriff Hall with multiple deprivation, our roundtable needs to use this window of opportunity to interrogate the current context within which human rights legislation applies. Many current international and UK human rights treaties don't legally recognise the economic, social, cultural or environmental rights. They do, however, recognise civil and political rights, meaning that this is the case in Scotland. As many of you may already know, the First Minister's Advisory Group for Human Rights Leadership recommends a new human rights framework, which legally recognises the economic, social, cultural and environmental rights. We should fight for this in Scotland, given that situations such as the case at Sheriff Hall are unfortunately the reality for many people. Our human rights team strongly believes that we've got a meaningful foundation upon which to base the argument that these economic, social, cultural and environmental rights are based upon humanitarian principles that promote into Scots law, social justice and enhance well-being for everyone. The incorporation of these rights would arguably have a profound impact on those living in and around the area of Sheriff Hall, and of course those experiencing other violations of their economic, social, cultural and environmental rights within different contexts as well. It would ensure that needs which, such as Natalie said, and humanitarianism is based upon, are significantly adhered to and upheld. So, recommendations for Scotland moving forward. It's recommended that we can and should apply a humanitarian approach to human rights in Scotland. And as Natalie said, Scotland is now in a position where it can change the discourse around which our human rights are based. So the new framework will arguably draw upon a more holistic approach to human rights so that humanitarian principles and human rights overlap. And through legally recognising the economic, social, cultural and environmental rights, Scotland can address the needs and overlapping rights of the most underrepresented groups in society, making explicit humanitarian principles central. We're currently in a global climate crisis. Therefore, there's already a declining need or desire for new or continued road infrastructure development. Alongside efforts against climate change, social justice, health and well-being improvements must become tangible realities for socioeconomically deprived citizens, well actually, everyone really. With all of this in mind, it can be argued that it is therefore not the time to start building more roads. Economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights need to become legitimate material considerations upon which to justify the irresponsible nature of such policy initiative and fight back against decisions so irrelevant to current times. Humans need clean air to thrive within collective spaces, and our planet needs clean air for these collective spaces to sustain healthy life. And so shouldn't this need be a legally recognisable and justifiable right? A humanitarian perspective to human rights will ensure questions and considerations of this nature are seen as legitimate. Without humanitarianism, not only will this arguably not happen, but crucial answers will not get aired. So, as a concluding thought for this discussion, is a flyover on a roundabout really justifiable for people and planet? Over to you, Gary.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much, Laura and Natalie. And I'm going to now open this for questions to both of you, if that's all right, and perhaps a general discussion. Many of the people attending have perhaps different, contrasting or similar views on what's been said. And I'm going to ask Hannah if she would very kindly oversee the questions and see if people's hands are up, because on this little system I'm on, I'm afraid I can't see more than a couple at a time. So Hannah, over to you, and if you wouldn't mind emceeing the questions. Thank you.
Sure, Gary. So if you would like to ask a question or if you have a comment about any of the presentations, or you can click on the reactions at the bottom of the screen where you can raise your hand, or if you prefer not to speak, you can put a question or a comment in the chat box. So actually, I have a question. It's more of a political question, and I'm not sure if either Laura or Natalie will be able to answer it, because I feel like this is a problem that a lot of politicians and a lot of people nowadays are struggling to kind of balance. But especially with your presentation, Laura, you're talking about the flyover. So it seems to me that a lot of the arguments for these things are quite economically oriented. A lot of people, they don't necessarily support environmental rights just because they don't see the effects of it in the short term. A lot of people don't want to act on it now because they don't see it now. The actions that we have to implement now are for the long term, is what I'm trying to say. So how do we kind of balance these short-term and long-term needs, and how do we convince these people that we need to protect the environment in the long run, when a lot of people now are, you know, struggling with hunger, with poverty, and they need jobs and a lot of jobs are kind of detrimental to the environment. So how do we kind of balance that? And I know it's a big question, but I just wanted to ask and see if anyone had any opinions or comments.
That was a question that sparked my dissertation, and even now that I've done my dissertation, in hindsight, I don't have the answer. So, which possibly reflects negatively on the way that society is now. So I would also love to hear any answers to that question if anyone does have any opinion on it.
So I believe Casey had her hand up first. Casey, would you like to speak?
Sure. So on that question, I think, you know, obviously with the Human Rights Task Force recommendation to incorporate into Scots law the right to a healthy environment that came out 2-3 weeks ago, you know, that is one of the things that the Scottish government is taking forward, or plans to take forward, obviously contingent on the elections and politicians as well. But I think one of the questions that seems to have been missed here, and one thing that's really important and where there's been a lot of discussion in the task force, is about the participation of the people who, you know, you're talking about how they are suffering from different inequalities. But I think one of the ways that we've struggled is to explain how inequalities are exacerbated by environmental degradation in a way that is meaningful for the individuals you're trying to protect, their right to a healthy environment, because for them sometimes easier access and the flyover probably seems like a really good idea if it means that they can leave their house 5 minutes later to get to their job where they're driving, and that tends to be something that engagement with particular groups that we're trying to help often is something that's missed out of the equation. So it's about coming up with, you know, we talk about bike paths and that's wonderful, but if you don't have, you know, if you've got multiple children, so say for me, I always think it's a great idea. I would love to cycle everywhere, but actually coordinating both my kids and my family and doing everything just doesn't actually facilitate that. I'm sure it could if I worked on it really hard, but if you don't have time, and if I don't have time, someone who's working multiple jobs and has multiple children going different places. So I think it's actually, we have to take a step back and think about how to deconstruct that platform for developing this connection between what we do in our everyday activities and how that has a long-term effect. I mean, one of the ways that other jurisdictions, say recently in Colombia, the case with the future generations is that children brought a case on. In fact, one of my students that's on here might be able to speak to this better than I can because they used it as part of their case study. But, you know, there is the idea of using future generations as giving them standing. And so in terms of raising claim to protect from future environmental harm. I'm going to be quiet now, but I just wanted to throw that kind of discussion into the mix because I think there were a few things that were not necessarily included in the presentations, which with a short period you can't do that. But I think those are some of the questions that seem to be missed out a lot when these discussions are taking place. And then also just there was one point made about the humanitarian principles. You know, humanitarian principles, it's more than just principles. There is law regarding humanitarian, the humanitarian principles. They are legalized as well. And the UK is very much part and parcel to instruments of law that demand the same recognition and legalization as human rights. So anyway, sorry, that was rather long-winded, but thank you.
Thank you, Casey. I just wanted to give an opportunity to either Laura or Natalie to respond to that before I move on to Kurt.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point that you made in terms of kind of deconstructing what the impacts of today are for tomorrow, and in that sense simplifying it so that almost like the equation can be seen in a simpler and easier way for people. And I think in terms of like the TPNW and also just general anti-nuclear initiatives and movements, that's a very prominent thing in terms of looking at the future generations and seeing, well, you know, just because the weapons aren't used today, how is detracting all of this money away from education and healthcare, how is that going to benefit them in the future? Or for example, you know, you can never predict when a nuclear accident or a nuclear malfunction is going to happen. How is that going to impact them? And with the TPNW, Beatrice Finn particularly used the testimonies of the Hibakusha, especially the Hibakusha who were very young when the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped. And that was it was almost kind of surreal for the audience because it was so real. And I think it's the rawest moment you have there where a child is put at such risk. And it's almost that factor of the innocent future generations and the innocent people, kids of the past as well, who have had to suffer under these political antagonisms. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. I'll definitely incorporate that.
Thank you. So Kurt, would you like to speak?
Thank you. Thank you both for very interesting discussion. I have a question for each of you. First for Natalie. Given that all the nuclear powers have not signed up to the treaty, and the UK, for example, is actually planning on expanding its production of nuclear weapons, and we have unacknowledged nuclear powers like Israel. What effect do you think this treaty will actually have on the spread and or use or non-use of nuclear weapons? And for Laura, Casey sort of precipitated part of my question, but let me try to frame it in a slightly different way. When I was looking at the two pictures, I was trying to figure out what the actual problem was. Because looking at the pictures, it looked like it was all green around the roundabout or the flyover area. And it looked like that regardless, there would be a lot of traffic going through the roundabout. And it seems to me that having a flyover makes it actually more efficient for people to get through that area, which might actually reduce pollution in some way. So is there some need? I'm not familiar with this particular area. So is there some particular housing establishment or something just out of the picture that might be significantly affected or something like that? And also to follow up on Casey's final point about humanitarian principles and law. Now, when I think about humanitarian principles and humanitarian law, I'm thinking about the application of humanitarian principles in conflict, because that's what humanitarian law is about, Geneva Convention, et cetera. But it does seem to me that one of the most important principles or aspects of humanitarian law has to do with distinction between non-combatants and combatants. And that would seem to be a very core part of humanitarian law, which says that you cannot use nuclear weapons because you cannot distinguish between combatants and non-combatants when you use nuclear weapons. Thank you. Thank you both.
I guess I can go first. Thank you for your question. So this is kind of like a really debated topic at the moment, because in effect, now that the UK has decided to expand its nuclear arsenal to as many weapons as it had during the Cold War period, that is kind of a very symbolic and active renunciation of the TPNW and everything it stands for. It's also a complete disregard for its Article 6 obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it time after time says it staunchly abides by and, you know, will always support till the end. But this seems to have been just empty rhetoric this entire time, which is very saddening. And you know, it's not only immoral, it's not only illegal, it's also vastly unnecessary. So the thing with the TPNW that really struck me was that it was a very huge civil society effort. And I think that is often something that is very undermined in political circles and debates on treaties and movements and which policies and laws get passed. I think, you know, from a feminist perspective, this newly announced expansion of the nuclear stockpile is a bit of a chest beating. It's a bit of, I'm trying to stay relevant in this newly shaped world. And so to this extent, I think having the TPNW there is both kind of a rebuttal against this, and also showing that it's not only the nuclear weapon states that have a say and have a voice in the future of nuclear politics and how nuclear weapons are perceived and what status and value we assign to them. There are so many non-nuclear weapon states who also have a voice in the world, and through the TPNW have voiced this opinion and this perspective that nuclear weapons are irrelevant, they are immoral, and they pose a threat to the future. So I think that's what's really powerful about the TPNW. And it's also, you know, Article 6 of the NPT, the third part says that these states will pursue in good faith negotiations to complete disarmament. And it's been a really long time since the NPT was signed, since it came into force. And we haven't really seen, you know, a huge multilateral or global effort towards this. Sure, there have been other treaties like SALT, ABM, so many treaties between the US and USSR, but the UK has just done something that reverses so many years worth of work towards, you know, anti-nuclear weapons, abolishment movements, and this rhetoric of putting humanitarian needs, human rights, the right to live in peace without fear, you know, first. So I think the TPNW has a huge legal as well as symbolic value to that extent.
Thank you, Kurt, for your question. So just a little bit of clarification, if you don't know the area, the flyover is going to serve the purpose of making commuter traffic. Gary, if you want to jump in, if you hear any inaccuracies in my statement, please do tell me, because I know that you know a lot about the situation as well. But Sheriff Hall is designed to ease the flow of commuter traffic. And the argument that I made in my dissertation, and a few of the people that I spoke to in my interviews for the dissertation said that it will serve its purpose, but it will only benefit commuter traffic. And if you look at the Scottish Index for Multiple Deprivation, the communities in and around that Sheriff Hall area, not all of them, but the majority of them, are deprived in multiple aspects. And I looked into further detail for example, the area of Dalkeith is very deprived in terms of housing quality and income and health. So to be building a flyover next to areas in particular of deprivation during a climate crisis, I just wanted to know why. It does not seem like the time for that activity. Whereas when you could be developing other areas of transport, I do understand the need to still have obviously effective and efficient transport systems, but is another road really the way to do that? For example, you can better the quality of park and ride systems. For example, Gary has presented the argument to me before that the park and ride facility near the Sheriff Hall roundabout is on the completely wrong side for Edinburgh, going into the city centre. But if you were to adapt these the transport systems in a better way and encourage more people to use them, and for example, other environmentally friendly methods, for example, cycle lanes and the cycle lanes and park and ride, if you were to adapt these, encourage people to use them more, now is not the time to be building more roads in a climate emergency. And there's other ways to go about addressing the need for the reasons that Sheriff Hall Flyover is being built. Is this making sense? Does that make sense to you? I hope I've got it. I've got my point across in a good way without rambling too much. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Kurt, for your fantastic question. So I just wanted to quickly move on to Amelia, and then we also have 2 questions from Elaine and Stephanie, I believe. Amelia, would you like to
thanks,
speak?
Hannah. Yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself from the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. We are a new non-governmental organisation that has been set up by the environmental sector, specifically to advocate for law reform and for the human right to a healthy environment. So it was really great to hear your presentation, Laura. I just wanted to add a couple of current things and throw those into the mix. So Casey's already mentioned that the Human Rights Task Force has recommended that the human right to a healthy environment be included in Scots law. And we were delighted to see that the Scottish Parliament debated the human right to a healthy environment a couple of weeks ago. And what I would say is that parties from across the political spectrum, they really got it on environmental rights. They got environmental justice and the fact that those often suffering other injustices are disproportionately impacted by environmental issues. And everybody present at the debate seemed keen to press forward on this legislation early on in the new parliament. So we are working very much in this area, and I would urge everybody to follow us on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, where I'll put our handle in the link. And yeah, it's just a very exciting time. But I think also worth pointing out that in terms of the procedural aspect on the human right to a healthy environment, so giving people the right to hold governments and our institutions to account over environmental laws and decisions, Scotland is already obligated to implement these through its membership of the UK's membership of the Aarhus Convention. And we are not in compliance because it is very expensive to go to court in Scotland. And this obviously has impacts then all the way back through to policy. So that's something that we want to see progressed as well in the new parliament, alongside the progression of this new Human Rights Act. So yeah, really great to hear the presentation. And I think, Laura, what you said on transport equalities issues is spot on. I think the big issue, particularly with traffic modelling, is that often traffic models show that, you know, if you put more lanes for traffic in, that will help ease air pollution issues. But in the long term, it doesn't, because it just invites more car usage in, and we are so heavily dependent on cars, and we're seeing the impact that has. The transport sector is the second biggest contributor to climate emissions. So we want to see policies really which are helping people to find ways to not be so car dependent. So yeah, just really agree with what you said there. So that's me. Thank you so much for an interesting presentation.
Thanks for your response. Yes, what you were saying, I was trying to get that point across, but I think I actually instead started rambling a bit at the end. But I think I see Ian said he would maybe be able to answer the question a little bit better, so perhaps we could listen to his response.
Hi, thanks Laura, and thanks Gary and Natalie and Amelia. My name's Ian Cowan. I used to work alongside Amelia at the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, and I am an environmental lawyer. I worked in Glasgow in the 1990s during our roads campaign against the construction of a new motorway through Pollock Estate in the south side of Glasgow, which is now called the M77. I worked for a local campaign there, and that came out, that campaign happened at the same time as the construction of a bypass around Newbury in Berkshire, in England, and it followed, both of those campaigns followed on the publication of a report by a body called the Standing Advisory Committee on Trunk Road Assessment, SACTRA. You can probably still Google and find a copy of their reports from about early 1990s, I think, demonstrating that, just as Amelia has said, that traffic demand for road space by cars and by road traffic is elastic. It kind of varies according to the space that's available. So as soon as you create new road space, car users will revert to using the car when they may have been tempted, perhaps just by the levels of congestion, to shift modally from one mode to another. That's known as modal shift, between, to start using the railway that was really built in that part of the New Borders Railway was built through that area. So you may have noticed from the pictures that in Laura's first slide that the roundabout is still going to be there. It's just that the flyover is built over the top of it. It's true, as cars decelerate and accelerate away from the roundabouts, that there are higher levels of pollution around the roundabout, but that they will still occur. This is the point that I want to make, is that when the flyover is still there, it will release demand. So cars that want to go past the roundabout and have got no interest in using it will just go straight over the top. But all the other cars that have been put off using the roundabout in the meantime by the traffic that's caused by the bypass going through it, that road space will be freed up, and so it'll just generate additional amounts of traffic. The roundabout will be just as busy as it is now, and air pollution will be even worse because there'll be additional air pollution from the flyover going adding over the top. So it's I guess it's quite a long-winded argument, but there is good evidence to show that that's what happens with when new road space is different. So what we should be trying to do is reduce demand for car use by improving public transport, making it cheaper. Policies like making bus travel free for under 21-year-olds excellent. That's the kind of policy we should be producing, meeting people's needs by meeting the needs of all communities by increasing access to transport, affordable transport for everybody, rather than concentrating on making things better for car users.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Amelia. So we're aware of the time. We do have 2 questions in the chat, and then I'll move on to Janet, who I know has her hand up. So Elaine here says, what is the quantitative evidence that a flyover will increase levels of traffic and pollution? Rail services are also finishing earlier in the evening. People who previously used rail travel are now purchasing vehicles. How do we address the need for transport to employment?
I have a feeling that Ian possibly just answered that.
Yeah. Yes, I agree so, but I just wanted to read it out. I didn't want to miss anyone's questions. So Stephanie here has a question. Could the argument be made that by creating better infrastructure in areas of deprivation, you are increasing economic opportunity through the creation of jobs in building the flyover and improved access to the area for industrial development? I believe that's also quite a similar question. Sorry. So Janet, would you like to speak?
Hello. David and myself are both involved in another UN House project, Secure Scotland, and I've found this discussion absolutely fascinating so far. 2 of my favourite topics. I mean, the treaty is something that I was a civil society advocate for throughout. And I just so welcome Natalie's very capable and articulate expression of what went on there. On the other topic, I've got a personal interest because I live very near it. I used to live in Craigmillar. I travelled across that area for the last 30 years and have seen the impact of the roads on the area, and it's been pretty negative in a general way, and certainly as far as the environment for the people that live there. And the reason I mentioned Secure Scotland is because I think this comes down to a very important part of what we're trying to do here in terms of the articulation of what humanitarianism actually means for people, because I think Casey's point about the experience of people that are suffering deprivation, not having time to raise their eyes to the hills and actually look at what the long-term solutions might be. People that are working in Helensburgh and that are seriously concerned that their difficult living circumstances are going to be even more reduced if we get rid of Trident, and they think their jobs are all going to be on the line. These are the kind of questions that are very often addressing the very people whose needs are most likely to be affected by all of this stuff. I mean, I think it's very indicative that one of the strongest non-nuclear armed opposing states for the TPNW is Japan, and it breaks my heart. It really does. And I think that what we're trying to do with Secure Scotland is ask a very simple question of everybody, which is what makes you feel safe? What actually contributes to your basic security? And somehow out of this process, that is what we need to do in order to change the dialogue. And I certainly know that that was the experience that we had with the TPNW. It wasn't responding to the inquiries about national security and posturing and relationships between governments that actually got us anywhere. It was saying, never mind all that. Do you know what a nuclear weapon actually does to people, what it actually does to the land? How could you ever justify that as a reasonable way of behaving? And in the same way, I think if we're going to have good human rights in Scotland, we need to hear from people about what are their day-to-day, everyday concerns about the things that keep them safe, about whether that's having to work less, whether that's about having better street lights, whether that's about feeling that they're not living in a patriarchal and violent society where they can't walk home at night. These are the questions that will produce some of the answers that we need to that question.
Thank you, Janet. I just wanted to know if Laura or Natalie have any other further comments, either regarding your comment, Janet, or just in general.
Yeah, I have a quick comment. It kind of links to, I completely agree with everything Janet says. If anything, she's one of my inspirations for getting into nuclear politics and dealing with all of this stuff. I have a comment in terms of one of the questions was about the kind of like the economic side of building a flyover and like the jobs that it could create, and essentially, you know, how many people it could take out of unemployment, if you like. And I'm currently reading this book by Yuval Noah Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. It's a really good book. And this is in relation to kind of like the increased automation and how that's going to basically get rid of a lot of jobs in the future. And he interestingly points out that the Scandinavian countries follow the motto of protect workers, not jobs. And reading that, I could kind of see parallels with that in terms of the nuclear industry, the military industrial complex, and also just in general, how the economy works and how the government perpetuates this cycle of having more and more jobs, but without taking in or factoring in the considerations of the consequences that these jobs are having on the environment or on the workers themselves. And I think if there's anything, you know, as well as the other things we can learn from the Scandinavian countries, it's that, I think that motto is so true and really useful for looking at the topics that we're discussing, protecting people and putting their needs and, you know, their basic necessities first, rather than jobs and the economy and, you know, the infrastructure. That was my closing remark.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Janet. So I believe we have run out of time for this discussion. There are further opportunities for more discussions. If you have further questions, I see Elaine has posted one. Please do bring it up in your breakout room or when we return to plenary later. Gary, I'll pass on to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, everyone. So at this point, if you could just stand up, turn around, get your muscles moving, and then 3-4 minutes time, Hannah and Shannon will have directed you, when you sit down, they will have directed you to a breakout room. So don't turn off, keep on the machine, and it will go to your breakout room. And after about 30 minutes, we will come back to the plenary, where we will generate the ideas from the breakout rooms, and also some of the points that have been raised in this session. I would just add that we are taping this, we're recording this, and we do have rapporteurs, and our idea from this is to create a very important record through a report that will in fact go to quite a number of people, including at their request, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and the Minister for Equalities and Human Rights, amongst many others. And I feel quite certain that the discussions that we've had just now will play a very important role in the creation of that report. So at this point, we thank you for your attendance in the first part, and we hope that the breakout rooms will generate further interrogation of these ideas and the unpacking of much of what has been said. It's been so interesting. Thank you very much. Now, Hannah and Shannon, you do your bit while everybody stands up and has a cup of tea or moves around. Thank you.
So it's you and me, Janet, is it?
Well, so they say, yeah.
I think you should go ahead. No, I think you should go ahead. I've got quite a challenge here.
I've got a bit of a challenge here too, because I think anyway, we had a very good conversation. We didn't stick to entirely to the discussion points and questions, although we did look at the three main questions, and then I mean, one of the topics was that was very much at the forefront was looking at the distinction between humanitarianism and human rights law, and where the one should inform the other. So we spoke a bit about that, and also about how humanitarianism might be included in human rights law. We then moved on to a bit more of a discussion around the impact of the recent pandemic on this kind of discussion. We spoke about responsibility as well as accountability, I think most people in the group participated at some level or another, and so I hope we can hear from people within this group, because they can be articulate about what was said. I know we also spoke about the importance of compassion and the place for compassion in all of this, and the very sharp divide that exists between what are our rights and what responsibilities do people have. We spoke about the state using the pandemic to undermine human rights, particularly with regard to surveillance and the right to protest. And we had some comparison between how governments had responded in different states and different state styles, and the more concerned with capitalism, the less well they responded to this situation in a in an effective humanitarian way. So those were the kind of those were the main issues that we discussed, and people can actually talk about some of the arguments that were raised when we've gone round what happened in the other groups. I think, David, I'm sure you can talk about what happened in your group, and maybe Carlos could give us some feedback on his group, whether the conversations were similar, and how we might do what we do in the bit of time we've got left. It was very valuable, very interesting. I mean, I personally will take a lot away from the discussion and hopefully follow up with some of the people that I've met in the room I was in. So, David, can you give us some feedback?
Happy to go ahead now, and echoing a heck of a lot of that. I mean, I was saying to the group as we got our countdown at the end, this is a really difficult task. It's like being asked, what did you have for dinner? We said, we had 25 courses. Do you want to hear about them all? What you want to hear perhaps is, yeah, it was really nutritious, and it definitely was. And I've taken so much away from it personally. Maybe I could just add a couple of things that came out. We talked a lot about the distinction between humanitarian issues and human rights law, and used needs and rights as part of that, and perhaps tentatively getting towards a position where saying what we know as human rights law, UN Convention or the European Convention, maybe the humanitarian aspects are there in seed and essence, and they can be teased out, and as lawyers tend to do. I liked also the statement from, I think it was Christine, saying, I don't need to be a lawyer to handle this, and I just thought that was so appropriate, putting it that way. We also talked about the right to protest, and we talked a lot about the nuclear aspect, and got some encouragement from realizing that, in fact, Britain's recent piece of nonsense is actually globally regarded as a piece of maverick outlying behavior, and I think that's how we need to present it. I think finally, there's a point I want to make which I've completely forgotten, but is really, really important. Maybe if we move on, I'll remember it and come back to it. It happens a lot these days. Maybe we should hear from Carlos now.
Yeah, that would be good. Just before we hear from Carlos, there were a couple of things.
Can I jump in? I've remembered what it is. It was Ian was making the point that the process that brought the TPNW into existence and into reality is one that the climate change movement could well consider, because it's not about the old NPT and various summits numbers game between states. It's about saying this is something that's arising from people's needs globally. We need a ban. We need to ban things. And I just thought that was really insightful. And I was referring to the fact that I've seen an article making the very same point, which I'll try to circulate once I find it. That was it. Sorry, Janet.
Okay, no, I was going to say there were two things that we spoke about. One was how you get remedy for when it goes wrong, and the other was about the importance of transparency in government in their how they're working out their preparedness for different eventualities, so that we can actually see when they're not doing it. Anyway, Carlos, please. Carlos?
Well, we mainly discuss how the main states. Well, yeah. Can you hear me fine? I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. well, we discussed how the main states or the nuclear powers are against to sign or to ratify the NPT. So they argue that they have to establish or to maintain their national safety. Also, we discussed the difference between international humanitarian law and human rights law, and how human rights are implicit humanitarian, but there are some difference between the applicability of this type of legal bodies and the circumstances that are related to the applicability. So also we discussed about the to issues, because they're not just environmental per se, they actually are social, economical, and they increase the difference, the economical difference between countries and regions of that country, and how politicians are some kind neglected to address these agendas, and how civil society have made little steps during a certain period of time to reach the politicians' discourse, and how they can benefit from the voters when they address this kind of discourse. Those were the main topics that we talk about, and I'm also very pleased to hear different point of views and how we were certain we were related on certain point of view, and we nourish the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I mean, I think at this stage we've got to be really aware of the time, because we're nearly out of time, but I would just like to, I mean, taking David's point about the nutritious meal, and it was a very nutritious meal all round, that seems like, but if there is anyone in any of the groups that feels that there was something, some great discovery or lightning moment that they would like to ensure that we all know about, that's been missed from these summaries, now's your chance to jump in with it before I hand back over to Gary.
Was there a fourth group with Natalie?
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
I'm so sorry, Natalie.
No, it's okay. No worries at all.
And I've not given you much time.
It's okay. All the topics, all the points that you guys touched on were kind of exactly what we spoke about. We also we took in a specific lens on women's health and women's rights, and domestic abuse particularly, and how that has risen during COVID, and kind of what's the infrastructure in place for kind of mitigating that and providing healthcare access and support to women. And Elaine mentioned how the rights of children in such instances are particularly detrimental, and there's not enough being done to kind of provide them with that universal health, that human right to safety and security and protection. So we touched on that, and also Amelia shared her insights on how we can meet the SDGs in terms of environmental protection through existing legal frameworks, and whether this change ultimately comes from civil society, as in the case of the TPNW, or because we touched a lot about budgets and redirecting resources that the government uses currently for certain things such as transport or nuclear weapons, redirecting that money towards things that impact humans, for example, healthcare and protecting the environment. So it was a very fruitful discussion, and yeah, I'll pass over to Gary.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic couple of hours, I think. We've covered a huge amount of material, and I mean, there are one or two issues that I'm just going to raise from what's been said this afternoon, but also to remind you that this is just step one. We are going to write a report from this, and our rapporteurs are going to work with Shannon to ensure that the report reflects the wide range of issues, the issues that have been mentioned on the economy. That it's really, I thought it was very interesting, the point that Natalie just mentioned, the issue of financial budgets and how it's terribly costly to move into a humanitarian approach to finance and budgeting. And I think it was quite, every single group, I think, mentioned that the pandemic has drawn attention to the impact on human rights, be it through surveillance or be it through protest, or the right to health itself being exacerbated through the pandemic. We started off by saying that the human rights discourse should also focus on cultural, social, environmental rights, not merely civil and political rights. And I think that's come through in everything that we've been saying. And it was noted that humanitarianism could be seen to be centered on needs, whereas human rights, for all the reasons that we have been speaking about, are much more likely to focus on rights per se. And if you were in our group, group 3, we were saying how it becomes very anthropomorphic if we move into humanitarianism. We move away from the focus on humanity and humans as the key issue, the key focus, those that have rights, whereas there are so many systems, ecological and other systems in our planet, and they may well survive, whereas the human might not, should there be any catastrophe that we started off with Natalie's talk telling us about. So the overriding principles of humanitarianism refer to the impact on humans and on the environment. With human rights, the overriding principles tend to be on international human rights law. So it's a different focus. And it's terribly important for us, I think, at this point to recognize that we have much to, as one group said, we have much to unpack, and we need to market, I'm not sure how, but we need to market our ideas so that we have a sort of juggernaut, a snowball effect of moving forward with what we have been discussing this afternoon. And with that in mind, we will, I hope, have a second roundtable on issues that have emerged from this. So as we come up to 4 o'clock, I'm going to say that the report that we will produce will bring in these issues and more. We will have an appendix with the links that have been mentioned. And I thank you so much, Natalie and Laura, for starting this conversation today. Actually, we've been at this for about 9 months now, haven't we? One way and another, speaking in our planning group. And it's quite spectacular for us to know that we have friends who are able to work with us in doing what Group 1 said, market and unpack our ideas. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. And I hope that you'll be able to come to Roundtable 2 when we move on to that. Thank you.